All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We try to check out great theories that you probably haven't heard of at all, but they would be maybe make a big impact on your life if you and when you do finally hear about them. These are things that have been suppressed, a lot of times things that people have spent their whole life working on and never got any credit, never got paid, but kept doing it because they knew they were pursuing the truth. And they ended up hitting a home run, but nobody's ever read it before. Things like that. And this is Bible Decode number 260. And there are several people out there to tip your hat to, who have spent their whole life trying to kind of decode the Bible and reading in the original languages and all of them, you know, Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek and Latin and Syriac and even hieroglyphics and Sumerian, to figure out what the hell these people were talking about. And a few of these people, I think, did hit a home run, but nobody's heard about it. So we are looking at the various aspects of that, especially those regarding the Roman origins hypothesis. There have been many scholars who have put in that kind of effort to arrive at the conclusion that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, the Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that were in charge of the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And I think they enlisted some of their court historians and court intellectuals to put together the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Romans had just gotten done defeating the Jews in a war that lasted for 7 years. Vespasian and Titus were generals in that war, and they also had been eyewitness to one uprising after an insurrection, after a terrorist attack, after an assassination, after a full-blown war from the Jews. The Jews were super high maintenance for the Romans in their empire, more difficult to handle than any other nation or tribe within the Roman Empire. And I believe that the Romans finally decided to reach into their bag of psychological operations, which they were expert at, and take advantage of the fact that the Jews were literally waiting on a Messiah. And the Jews were waiting on a Messiah who was a military commander, who was going to help the Jews defeat the Romans and kick them out of Judea. And so instead, the Romans wrote about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' heavy backpack, and identifying the Roman slave-owning centurion as the possessor of the greatest faith in all of Israel, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And at the same time, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers at the temple, and casting out the Jewish vendors who were selling small animals for the sacrifice in the temple. So Jesus is taking aim at the Jewish traditions and the Jewish people while he is deferential to the Romans. And then as we proceed in the New Testament, we see that Paul is even more deferential to the Romans and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. And so those should be red flags to think that maybe something's up. Maybe these masters of psychological operations had something to do with it. Given that you ask the question, cui bono, who benefits? Well, the Romans would have benefited by having a tamed or domesticated Jewish population who was much more willing to assimilate and obey the Roman customs. The Romans were happy with you to follow your own religion, but they wanted you to also give a nod to theirs. And the Jews were not willing to do that for obvious reasons, because they would have been punished by their jealous and zealous God. So, the evidence, other than this, giving out the motives and the MO of the Romans, the evidence for this is overwhelming. But it really, you're not able to decode it until you recognize that there's another book involved. And that book was written by the Romans, by a guy named Flavius Josephus of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Now, Josephus was an adopted member of the Flavian dynasty who was originally a Jew, and he was originally one of the military commanders for the Jews in this war. And then eventually he was captured by Vespasian, and he had an epiphany which caused him to defect to the Romans. He believed that now God supports the Romans and not the Jews. He predicted that one day Vespasian would become the new emperor, and when Vespasian did, he pardoned Josephus and brought him to Rome to make him the court historian, put him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. And Josephus wrote a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews. It's called War of the Jews. And if you read War of the Jews in conjunction with your Gospels, you will see glaring, blatant parallels between the two. Sometimes one is parodying the other, and sometimes the other is parodying the first. There's a mutual parallelism going on that is difficult. You're not going to see it unless you're looking for it. But once you're looking for it, it kind of jumps off the page at times, and it is full of intentionality. You can tell that you can kind of see some of the motives of the Romans who were putting some of this together. And a lot of it is like just pure hate for the Jews. A lot of it is brutal humor, body humor, demeaning, ridiculing, mocking attitude toward the Jews. And really anybody else who reads these Gospels and believes them. The people that wrote these things are like some of the worst people that have ever lived on the planet. The Roman emperors of the first century. Totally debauched and, deranged, violent, and just, just lacking lacking in basic decency on a certain level, and just, you know, entitled, really thinking that they really, I mean, Titus and Vespasian really thought, I mean, they thought they were gods. Many of the Roman emperors, I mean, they thought they were gods. So to do this kind of thing with the Jewish God, you know, or kind of an attempt to kind of veer off from the Jewish God, is certainly exactly what they would have done. And so once you start to see the parallels, then it becomes obvious. The Michael Menescotts, in his book Christianity's Origin, looked into the book of Luke and found over 250 parallels with the War of the Jews. And some of them, many of them, are very detailed and just uncanny. They must have put a great deal of time and effort into this, because there are so many that are interwoven just like seamlessly and almost creatively. Now, some of the parallels are not that strong. They're just there to fit the pattern. And the pattern, according to Menescotts, comes from graphing all of the parallels on a chart, using the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. By plotting all 250 of the points at their you know, location, where, you know, their corresponding location, he formed 5 near perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Latin being the language of the Roman elite, and APTVS standing for at least Titus Vespasian. And there's some debate about the other letters. The bottom line is that the Romans literally signed their name to the book of Luke, so that someday somebody would discover that this is what was going on. The New Testament is a psychological operation. You can also see it if you look at the ministry of Jesus in the Gospels. All the places that he goes and all of the stories that are told about him in the book of Luke. And then if you look at the War of the Jews and you see Titus, and his it describes General Titus and his military campaign in Judea. He arrives in about 69 AD after his father Vespasian is named emperor. So General Vespasian gives way to his son General Titus, and General Vespasian goes off to Rome to become the new emperor. And when Titus gets there, it describes, War of the Jews describes all the different places that he goes and the battles that he fights and so on and so forth. And turns out that the story of Jesus is a replica of the story of Titus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location. And each event is spaced by 40 years. The events in the gospel occur 40 years before the events in War of the Jews. Doesn't mean that they were written 40 years earlier, but they describe events from 40 years before. And there are over 40 such events. It's not just like 3 or 4 in the same order. It's over 40 of them. And so that goes way beyond the realm of, possible coincidence. Anyway, what we're looking at now is we're looking at a book called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, written by Robert Eisenman. And Eisenman sniffs at the door of the Roman origins hypothesis but he wasn't familiar with it, at least at this time when he was writing this particular article that we're looking at in chapter 4 of this book, which is called Paul as Herodian. But it's notable here because he identifies Paul. He sees that there is a huge red flag about Paul, about his behaviors in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts, and the epistles, where he is extremely pro-Roman and extremely anti-Jewish, especially of the Jewish traditions, circumcision, and the Sabbath, and kosher food, and he wants to move the religion away from those things, which again would be, extremely strange and extremely Roman. So we'll start right here. Josephus, and I think this is about where we started yesterday. Like, we didn't really get too far. It is noteworthy that Josephus, too, knows a propagandist named Ananias, whom he calls a merchant, active in these eastern regions in the upper and lower Tigris at this time. He gets in among the women of Diabene and converts the queen, Helen, while taking a patently Pauline line on the issue of the circumcision of her son. In this episode, Josephus also mentions a colleague of Ananias following the same approach, but declines to name him. It is in opposing him and deciding to circumcise himself that Helen's son Isaetes and following him Monobazas are converted to Judaism. While these points are not decisive, they are nevertheless edifying. Now, I pointed out yesterday also that this character Isaetes, Helen's son Isaetes, is the person that Ralph Ellis identifies as the historical Jesus in his book King of Edessa. Isaetes, or Izas, King Izas of the Jews. And he was, according to Ellis, involved, one of the leaders involved in the revolt of 66 AD that kicked out Herod Agrippa II from Jerusalem and caused Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And so Isaetes, or Izas, was a short-lived Jewish Messiah whose legacy the Romans would have had a great interest in suppressing. And so this could have been the character that the Romans used as a model for Jesus, maybe even just his name, or maybe there's some events from his life that either were watered down to put into the New Testament or were altered or spun in the Romans' direction, or maybe they just, I'm sure they used a whole lot of other influences as well, but King Izas was probably one of them. Where the political aims of individuals of this Herodian mix are concerned, Herodian incursions via marriage and other means into Asia Minor, Turkey, meaning Cilicia, northern Syria, Commagene, and the like, and Lower Armenia, were certainly on the increase in the first century. For instance, the first Herodian ruler of Armenia proper was a grandson of Herod, again via his Maccabean wife Miriam, called Tigranes. Other Herodians were married to the king of Cilicia, denoted in Acts as Paul's place of origin. There is also a note of conspiratorial activities against Rome, where Agrippa I and Antiochus of Commagene are concerned. This is not the case for Agrippa I's son Agrippa II, or his brother Herod of Chalcis after this, who were perfect Roman civil servants. Antiochus, who blamed Rome for the death of his son, ultimately did lead a revolt in the wake of the Jewish war. Herod of Chalce's son, Aristobulus, who, like Agrippa I, proudly proclaimed his pro-Roman sentiments on his coinage, made himself very useful to the Romans in helping to suppress this revolt. Okay, so there were a lot of Jews and a lot of Herodians who, put down the revolt of the Jews. Even though they were Jews themselves, they put down the revolt on the side of the Romans. It is possible we have a reflection of him in Paul's reference to, quote, the household of Aristobulus, preceding the one to his my kinsman Herodian in Romans 16:10. Many of these areas in Asia Minor and northern Syria, too, are the scenes of Paul's most aggressive early missionary work. Aristobulus must be seen as one of the inner circle around Titus, General and Emperor Titus, along with Tiberius Alexander, Josephus or Josephus, Bernice or Berenike, and Agrippa II. So, like I said yesterday as well, but it might have not been recorded, these are really the people, probably the very people that wrote the New Testament. These, 6 people? Five people, and then you add in Titus. Now, Josephus is of questionable origin, whether he really existed or not, or whether he was a pseudonym of some other Roman. But regardless, they had to have been experts in Jewish, in the Torah and the other Jewish scriptures, and they probably needed to have been, fairly expert in just Jewish culture and traditions. And so, these Herods, along with Tiberius Alexander, who was the nephew of Philo, Judaeus, who was a Greek Jewish intellectual in Alexandria, and Bernice, who was a Herod, and I think they were both Hasmoneans, which are the Maccabees, which is the ruling dynasty of the Jews from second and first century BC. And then Agrippa II, another Herod, very loyal to Rome, but Jewish in, culture, or certainly they grew up with some Jewish connections and culture to make a believable version of the New Testament. You can't really write the New Testament unless you have some concept of Jewish law and culture. So it is he who is married to Herodias' infamous daughter Salome, that's Agrippa II, whose picture, along with himself, he proudly displays on his coinage as great lovers of Caesar. And they're considered responsible, with her mother Herodias, in the New Testament for the death of John the Baptist. Salome is the woman who dances and pleases Herod, and Herod then offers to do anything that she wants. And she consults her mother Herodias and says, "Bring me the head of John the Baptist." And Herod is like gulping. What? Okay. That's not what I had in mind. But anyway, in fact, it was not Herodias who was married to Philip, as the Gospels would have it, but rather Salome herself. Herodias being married to another uncle named Herod, the son of the second Miriam mentioned above. This Philip, Josephus specifically tells us, died childless. So Eisenman is trying to kind of reconstruct the genealogies here and playing the name game, the shell game of names, which happens in a lot of these biblical texts, especially when you recognize that you can't trust Josephus because he's in on some type of psyop. And so his history is not to be trusted along with the New Testament, not to be trusted, and so your sources are super limited. It's a good thing for the Dead Sea Scrolls if we can trust those. But I admire Eisenman for what he's doing, because he's really doing detective work here, trying to figure out who all of these random people in the New Testament, who they are. A lot of the people that are just kind of referred to offhandedly by Paul in the epistles and in the book of Acts especially are like either Herods or like actual Caesars, or at least Flavians, members of the Caesar's family. Those are a lot of the people that are just mentioned in the New Testament. But you would never know that. You just kind of pass over their names when you read them, because they're not like a featured character. While the subsequent marriage of Aristobulus to Salome, she was the daughter of his father's sister Herodias, is not strictly speaking an instance of marriage with a niece, so frowned upon at Qumran and practiced by Herodians as a matter of seeming family policy. It is the closest thing. But connections of this kind with close family cousins were in any case also condemned as fornication and incest in the Damascus document at Qumran. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. Niece marriage being considered but a special case of fornication and incest. It is also interesting to consider Herodian links with the Hellenized Alabarch in Alexandria. In the generation we are examining, the family of the latter not only produced the famous Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, but was considered the richest in Egypt, controlling the all-important granaries there and commerce in the Red Sea ports. It was also instrumental in Vespasian's rise to power in Rome. One of its scions, Tiberius Alexander, Philo's nephew, who became procurator in Palestine during the reign of Herod of Chalcis between 44 and 49 AD, ultimately re-emerged as Titus's military commander during the siege of Jerusalem after Vespasian went to Rome to become emperor. So that's right what we were talking about before. And this guy Tiberius Alexander, who is a very, very, very wealthy Jew, is in on it with Titus. And so you would think that he would probably have been in on it with Titus also about, the psychological operation to water down the Jewish scriptures in the form of the New Testament. Now, don't get me wrong. I have major issues with the Jewish scriptures also, but we'll get into that later for a completely different reason. But I see them as being not valid either. So Josephus, who understood these matters well, specifically called attention to Tiberius Alexander's defection from Judaism. So, as I mentioned before, Josephus himself defected from Judaism when he had the epiphany that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. Tiberius Alexander defected from Judaism, as he did Bernice's. So Bernice, the queen of the Hasmonean descent, or Herodian at least descent, also defected, who ultimately became Titus's mistress. Okay, so Bernice was having an affair with Titus. So these are the very people that would have been in on it, on this psychological operation to write the Gospels. It's kind of a rewrite because they wrote Mark and then they needed to repair Mark, and then they wrote Matthew, and they wanted to do better, especially with this code, to put the code into it. And they did that in the book of Luke. So Luke is kind of like the third draft that is a rewrite. They're all the same story, but Luke is the one that you use to do the decoding. Bernice's second sister, also named Miriam, was presumably after her grandmother, divorced her first husband, Julius Archelaus, himself the son of the Herodian temple treasurer and a putative kinsman of Saulus above, in order to marry someone even richer, seemingly another member of the family of the Jewish Alabarch of Alexandria. Agrippa I, third daughter, Drusilla, after contemplating marriage with the son of King Antiochus of Commagene in northern Syria, married Azizus, king of Emesa, because he had agreed to circumcise himself. As Antiochus' son, who later led a group of stalwarts called the Macedonian Legion on the Roman side at the siege of Jerusalem, had not. Displaying that cynical opportunism so typical of Herodians, Drusilla thereafter divorced Azizus on her own initiative, even though he had himself circumcised specifically to marry her. Instead, Drusilla married the Roman governor Felix, who was a governor from 52 to 60 AD. This marriage seems to have been connived at in Caesarea by someone very much resembling the infamous Simon Magus. Simon's singular service to Felix appears to have been to convince Drusilla to divorce Azizus and marry Felix. In this episode, many themes emerge which are of utmost importance for dating Qumran documents, like the Damascus document, on the basis of internal evidence and understanding the true gist of their critique of the establishment. Even Josephus, who is usually so accommodating on such matters, later finding Herodian practices congenial, he too divorces his wife, an action that would have been condemned according to Qumran doctrine. Describes Drusilla's self-divorce from the king of Emesa as contrary to the laws of her forefathers. As mentioned above, he makes a similar comment about the divorce by her aunt Herodias of her husband Herod in the previous generation, the root of the problems relating to the death of John the Baptist in both Josephus and the New Testament. These divorces were anticipated 2 generations before this by the divorce of Herod's sister Salome from the Idumean Costobarus, who so important in the genealogy of Saulus mentioned above. They are also reflected in the divorce by Miriam III, Drusilla's sister, from Julius Archelaus, and the marriage of whose father Helcias of the temple treasurer, also a descendant of Herod's sister Salome, to Cyprus, Saulus's sister, consolidated the overlap between these 2 lines of Idumeans. Can't say I understand